Medieval executioners were both feared and shunned. They couldn't shop in markets, marry freely, or even sit at taverns, yet they were indispensable to justice. Welcome to a little tour of one of history's most necessary and most loathed professions. A job where your key performance indicator was how cleanly you could ruin someone's day permanently. So, get comfortable, settle in. There's no need to stay awake for any of this. We're just going to drift through some of the quieter, more peculiar corners of the past. Let's begin with the concept of being dishonorable. In medieval Europe, certain professions were considered unclean, not because of hygiene, but because they dealt with death, filth, or other unsavory aspects of life. Tanners were on the list, as were gravediggers and night soil collectors. But at the very bottom of this social ladder, dwelling in a category all his own, was the executioner. He was a living paradox, a direct agent of the state, an arm of the law, but a man no respectable person would ever want to shake hands with. This wasn't just a matter of public opinion. It was often codified. Executioners were legally barred from holding public office, joining guilds, or even, in some places, touching food at the market that others would later buy. Imagine having to point at a loaf of bread and hope the baker understood you, because if your hand brushed it, it was considered tainted. It was a lonely existence, defined by a strange sort of invisible wall. The town executioner often lived in a designated house, usually set apart from the rest of the community, perhaps just outside the city walls, or down a specific, undesirable alley. It was close enough to be on call, but far enough for everyone else to feel a comfortable distance from his work. This physical separation was a neat metaphor for his social standing. The German-speaking world had a particularly strong concept of this. They called these professions unehrliche Leute, or dishonorable people. This wasn't a judgment on their character, necessarily. You could be a perfectly pleasant executioner, kind to animals and a loving father. It didn't matter. The work itself stained you. It was a ritual impurity passed down through generations because, of course, who would an executioner's son marry? No respectable family would offer their daughter. So he married the daughter of another executioner from a neighboring town. This created entire dynasties of executioners, closed-off clans who understood the family business. They became their own strange, isolated caste, a society within a society, bound together by the universal rejection of everyone else. It was the world's most depressing family reunion. The superstitions surrounding them were, as you can imagine, extensive. People believed the executioner had special powers. His touch could heal certain ailments, while at the same time, his shadow falling upon a pregnant woman could bring misfortune. It was a confusing mix of fear and desperate hope. Amulets made from pieces of the gallows rope or the finger of a condemned man were thought to be powerful charms. And who was the sole proprietor of these grim artifacts? The executioner, of course. He was the gatekeeper to a whole world of dark magic and folk medicine, a role he probably didn't ask for but learned to navigate. He was part civil servant, part pariah, and part reluctant wizard, a truly baffling job description for anyone to carry. Let's just let that thought settle for a moment. A government employee who also dabbled in selling cursed rope fragments. The medieval world was nothing if not creative in its career paths.
So what did an executioner actually do all day? The job was much more than just the dramatic final blow of an axe. That was the main event, certainly, but it was just a small part of a much wider and grimmer portfolio of duties. The executioner was, in essence, the state's designated specialist in all forms of corporal punishment. His toolkit was varied, and his workday could be unpredictable. He was the one called upon to administer brandings, which involved pressing a red-hot iron onto someone's skin to leave a permanent mark of their crime, a task requiring a steady hand and a complete lack of squeamishness. He also handled floggings, which were a common punishment for lesser crimes. This wasn't just random violence, it was a calibrated science. A certain number of lashes with a specific type of whip delivered with just the right amount of force. It was all very bureaucratic. Then there were the more elaborate procedures. The breaking on the wheel, for instance, a truly awful invention where a person's limbs were systematically broken with an iron bar while they were tied to a large wagon wheel. The executioner's job was to perform this gruesome task with precision, sometimes ordered to deliver a final, merciful blow to the chest, and sometimes ordered to leave the person to suffer. It was a performance, a public spectacle designed to horrify and deter, and the executioner was the star of the show, a silent, masked figure carrying out the grim choreography of justice. He was also responsible for hangings, which were far less straightforward than they sound. Calculating the right length of rope for the person's weight to ensure a quick death rather than a slow strangulation was a grim sort of arithmetic. A good executioner took pride in his efficiency. A botched execution was not only a tragedy for the condemned, but a professional embarrassment that could lead to a very angry mob. Beyond punishment, the executioner had a number of other municipal duties that fell under the umbrella of unpleasant. He was often the town's knacker, responsible for disposing of the carcasses of dead animals, horses, cows, stray dogs. If it died and wasn't for dinner, it was his problem. This meant he often operated the local flaying yard, a place that, you could imagine, did not smell wonderful. He might also be in charge of cleaning the town's latrines and cesspits, because when you're already considered the most dishonorable person around, why not add sewer maintenance to your resume? It's a classic case of other duties as assigned. This combination of roles made him an expert in all things society wanted to ignore: crime, death, waste, and decay. He was the manager of the town's dark side. One of the perks of the job was the right to the condemned's property. Often the executioner was legally entitled to the clothes the prisoner wore to their own execution. This led to a strange and macabre form of fashion recycling. He could also claim any possessions the person had on them. For this reason, prisoners on their way to the gallows would sometimes try to wear their finest outfits as a final macabre gift to their families, who could then buy the clothes back from the executioner. It was a bizarre little economy built around the last moments of a person's life. The executioner might also be paid per task, with a fee schedule laid out by the town council. So much for a flogging, a bit more for a branding, and the highest rate for a full execution. It was a grim way to make a living, invoicing the city for acts of ritualized violence. Let's just pause and think about that. Itemized billing for judicial torture. The paperwork must have been fascinating.
Given their social isolation, executioners had to be resourceful. Barred from most normal trades, they developed a portfolio of side hustles that were as strange as their primary job. One of the most fascinating of these was their role as unofficial medical practitioners. While the university-trained physician was quoting Galen and prescribing questionable potions for the wealthy, the executioner was getting a very hands-on education in human anatomy. Through his work in torture and dismemberment, he learned about bones, muscles, and sinews in a way no doctor of the time could. This intimate, if brutal knowledge had practical applications. An executioner knew precisely how to set a broken bone or how to treat a dislocated joint. People who couldn't afford a physician or who simply trusted the executioner's practical skill would secretly visit him for treatment. He was the master of what was known as bone setting. His house, set apart from the town, became a sort of clandestine clinic for the common folk. He could fix a fracture, tend to a deep wound, or even perform minor surgeries. It's a deeply ironic image. The man whose job was to break bodies was also the most skilled person in town at mending them. His knowledge wasn't just anatomical. Through his work, he also had access to certain materials. The hand of glory, for example, was a dried, pickled hand of a hanged man believed to have magical properties, and the rendered fat of executed criminals, known as sinner's fat, was a prized ingredient in folk remedies for everything from arthritis to open sores. The executioner was the sole supplier of this morbid pharmacopoeia, a dealer in forbidden cures. He was the original alternative medicine specialist. This medical work extended to veterinary care as well. As the town knacker, he was responsible for dead animals, which also made him the go-to expert for sick ones. He knew animal anatomy as well as human, and farmers would often call on him to treat an ailing horse or cow. He was, in a very real sense, the community's general practitioner for anyone or anything that the more honorable professionals wouldn't touch. Of course, he wasn't allowed to advertise these services. It was all word of mouth, a network of whispers that led people to his door under the cover of darkness. It was a strange relationship of trust and necessity, born from his unique and terrible expertise. The town shunned him in the daylight, but sought his help in the shadows. Besides medicine, he also had other duties. In some regions, the executioner was responsible for overseeing prostitution, essentially acting as a warden for the city's brothels. He would collect taxes from the workers and ensure order. It was another one of those tasks deemed too unclean for regular officials. He might also be tasked with dog catching, rounding up stray animals in the streets, or he could be the local exterminator in charge of rat catching. Basically, any job that involved dealing with things society found distasteful. Death, disease, filth, sin was likely to end up on his to-do list. He was the municipal jack of all unwanted trades. Imagine the resume: proficient in capital punishment, bone setting, sewer management, and animal carcass disposal. A real team player. It's a career path that doesn't exactly scream upward mobility. Let's just drift with that thought for a while. The quiet, multi-talented outcast, just trying to make a living.
The life of an executioner was not a solitary one. Even if it was isolated, he had a family, and for them, the profession was an inheritance. It was a trade passed from father to son, a grim legacy that was almost impossible to escape. An executioner's son had few other options in life. He was marked by his father's work from birth. No guild would take him as an apprentice. No respectable merchant would hire him. So he learned the family business. This apprenticeship started young. A boy might begin by helping his father with the less gruesome tasks, cleaning the tools, tending to the animals in the knacker's yard, or mixing ointments for the medical side hustle. As he grew older, he would be brought in as an assistant during public punishments. He would learn how to tie the knots for a hanging, how to heat the branding irons to the correct temperature, how to hold a person steady for a flogging. He learned the anatomy of the human body not from books, but from direct, brutal observation. His father would teach him the precise spot on the neck to aim for with the executioner's sword. A single, clean blow was the mark of a master. It was a highly skilled craft, and the training was intense and deeply personal. The goal was to become desensitized, to see the body as a thing to be worked on, not a person to be pitied. This professional detachment was the most important lesson an executioner could pass on to his son. It was a necessary tool for psychological survival. Because this was a hereditary trade, entire dynasties of executioners emerged, dominating the profession in certain regions for centuries. Perhaps the most famous of these was the Sanson family in France. They served as the state executioners for over 200 years, from 1688 to 1847. Charles-Henri Sanson, the most well-known of the line, was the chief executioner during the French Revolution. He was the man who executed King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and thousands of others during the Reign of Terror. He performed his duties with a quiet, almost bureaucratic professionalism, keeping meticulous diaries that recorded his work. He didn't see himself as a monster, but as a public servant performing a necessary, if unpleasant, function. His life was a testament to the strange normality that can settle over even the most extraordinary of circumstances. Marriage, as mentioned, was also an internal affair. Executioners' daughters married executioners' sons, forging alliances between families and consolidating the trade within a closed circle. These marriages were practical arrangements, born of necessity. A daughter of an executioner carried the same social stigma as her father and brothers. Marrying into another executioner family was her only real option for a stable life. These families created their own subculture with its own traditions and values. They might be shunned by the outside world, but within their own community, they found a sense of belonging. Imagine the family gatherings, uncles and cousins from neighboring towns, all sharing shop talk about the latest instruments or the difficulty of a particular sentence. It was a strange and insular world, a small island of the dishonorable in a sea of polite society. Let's just rest with that image, a family tree where every branch leads back to the gallows. The public execution was a piece of theater, and the executioner was its reluctant star. He was expected to play his part with solemn dignity. Often, he would wear a specific costume, in some places, a black or red cloak, and famously, a mask or hood. The mask wasn't just for anonymity, it was a symbolic device. It separated the man from the office. It helped transform him from a neighbor into an impersonal instrument of justice. The crowd, for its part, was a fickle audience. They came for the spectacle, for the moral lesson, and for the grim thrill. If the executioner performed his job cleanly and efficiently, he might earn a grudging respect. But if he botched the job, if the axe took more than one swing, or the hanging went wrong, the crowd's mood could turn in an instant. They would jeer, throw stones, and sometimes even riot.
The psychological toll of this work is difficult to fathom. To live a life where your most public moments involve inflicting pain and death on others, and to do so under the intense scrutiny of a judgmental crowd, required a profound level of mental fortitude. Many executioners developed rituals or coping mechanisms. Some were known to be deeply religious, praying for the souls of those they executed. They would often ask for the condemned's forgiveness just before carrying out the sentence. This wasn't necessarily for the prisoner's benefit, but for their own, a way to reconcile their actions with their conscience. They had to believe they were serving a higher purpose, that they were cleansing the community of its evils. Otherwise, the weight of what they did would be unbearable. The finances of the job were also complex. An executioner might receive a small annual salary from the town council, but this was often just a retainer. The bulk of his income came from fees for specific services. A town's account books from the period can be strangely illuminating, listing payments for a hanging, 10 lashes, or branding on the cheek. In addition to official payments, there were other streams of revenue. We've touched on the clothes of the condemned and the sale of macabre medical ingredients. But there was also the scavenger's right. In some places, the executioner had the right to go through the market and take a small portion of produce from each stall without paying. This was less a perk and more a form of tax collection that nobody else wanted to do. It also, of course, did little to improve his popularity with the local merchants. The job was a constant negotiation of social and economic survival. The executioner was a state official, but also an independent contractor. He was a pariah, but also an essential service provider. He held the power of life and death, but couldn't sit down for a drink at the local inn. This life of contradictions created a unique character, one forced to be pragmatic, resourceful, and emotionally resilient. He had to be a skilled craftsman, a small business owner, a medical practitioner, and a public performer, all while navigating a world that held him in contempt. It was a job that demanded everything and offered very little in return, except for a steady, if gruesome, line of work. Let's just let the absurdity of it all hang in the air for a moment. The quiet, lonely man, just trying to balance his books at the end of a long day of state-sanctioned mayhem.
As the centuries wore on, the world began to change, and with it, the role of the executioner. The Enlightenment of the 18th century brought with it new ideas about justice, punishment, and human dignity. Philosophers and reformers began to question the brutal public spectacles of the past. The focus shifted away from punishment as a form of horrifying theater and toward the idea of rehabilitation and more efficient methods of dispatch. This was not always born of pure compassion. There was also a desire for order and control, a feeling that the chaotic, emotional mob scene of a public execution was undignified for a modern state. The process of justice was moving behind closed doors. This trend culminated in the invention of a machine that would forever change the executioner's craft, the guillotine. First proposed in France by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, it was designed to be a great equalizer in death. It was quick, efficient, and, in theory, painless. It was also democratic. Nobles would no longer have the privilege of a swift beheading by sword, while commoners faced the agony of the wheel or the rope. Everyone got the same sterile, mechanical death. But this innovation had an unintended side effect. It made the executioner's skill obsolete. The art of the swordsman, the deep knowledge of anatomy, the steady hand required for a clean cut, none of it was needed anymore. The executioner was reduced to a mere technician, a machine operator. Charles-Henri Sanson, the famous French executioner, was the one who oversaw this transition. He went from being a master of the sword to the man who pulled the lever on the guillotine. He reportedly disliked the new device, finding it impersonal and grimly industrial. The art was gone, replaced by mechanical repetition. The reign of terror, with its thousands of executions, turned his work into a gruesome assembly line. The role of the executioner became less about skill and more about stamina. The public spectacle also began to fade. By the 19th century, most executions in Europe were moved inside prison walls, away from the public eye. The pariah, who was once the star of a public drama, was now a hidden functionary of the state, his work shrouded in secrecy. The old executioner dynasties began to die out as the social stigma lessened slightly and other career paths opened up. The sons of executioners were no longer forced to follow in their father's footsteps. The profession lost its hereditary nature. The last of the Sanson line retired in 1847, ending a nearly 200-year family tradition. In other parts of Europe, the story was the same. The role of public executioner was either abolished entirely or transformed into a sterile, bureaucratic post held by a civil servant. The strange world of the medieval executioner, the pariah doctor, the feared craftsman, the purveyor of magical charms, simply dissolved into the modern era. And so, a profession that was once a cornerstone of public justice, a bizarre and lonely calling, faded quietly into the history books. A strange, sad story for a quiet night. There's nothing more to see here. It's time to just let it go.